My parents dragged me along to the square, even though I had repeatedly told them that there was no point in me going. They kept telling me that this was going to be a once-in-a-lifetime experience, and that I would regret it for the rest of my life if I missed out. I kept pointing out to them that I was completely deaf, so I wouldn't be able to hear anything, but my mother promised she would translate for me. Everything. My mother hugged me after I agreed to stay, and she told me that she loved me. As the day progressed, I stood in the stifling heat and kept getting shoved around by people as they tried to get closer to the stage. My father offered to place me on his shoulders, but I declined as I was almost a teenager now. Suddenly, there was a change in the atmosphere in the crowd, and I glanced up to the stage to see a bunch of high-ranking clergy. As they began speaking, I looked over to my mother, but she was too entranced with what they were saying to translate for me. I glanced over my shoulder and noticed there were dozens of smiling children crowded around me. One of the children tried to ask me a question, but he was suddenly forced backwards as the crowd moved. I tried to spot him again, but I couldn't see through the wall of people. Then, there was a blinding light on the front of the stage, and I spun around to see the most beautiful woman I have ever seen walking forward. The clergymen looked confused for a second, but quickly composed themselves and stepped aside. The woman walked up to the microphone and glanced around at the hushed crowd that was awaiting her first words. I felt her eyes linger on me for a second, and a shiver of dread went down my spine. She finally opened her mouth and began to speak. It was at this moment I felt a splatter of rain fall on my face and quickly wiped it off with my sleeve. A wave of confusion crossed my face as my sleeve was now all red. I looked up at my mom and was horrified to see that blood was pouring out of her nose and eyes, but she had a weird look of contentment across her face. My father slowly slid to his knees with blood pouring out of all of his orifices. I looked around to ask for help, but was met with a sea of blood-smeared smiling faces. I stood there in shock as, one by one, they slowly collapsed to the floor. I felt a tap on my shoulder and slowly turned around. The woman stood there with a pleasant smile on her face and gave me a hug before turning around and disappearing into a white light. I stood there, all alone in the square, surrounded by smiling corpses, and finally understood why God never tried to communicate with us before. Hey everybody, I hope you liked that narration, though it was a short one. I did find the story intriguing. The story itself is called The Story of My, quote, once-in-a-lifetime, end quote, experience by Sugar Sewed. Additionally, we have some fun artwork for the thumbnail. That was produced by Nathan Howell. If you're interested in finding more by either of these artists, you can find that in the links in the description. As always, like, comment, subscribe, and peace out. See you next time.